the top schools, Eton and all those schools, charities, they were set up to help the poor, but the poor have not been the beneficiary of those.
This is the first systematic experience where you have systematically, changed people fundamentally.
Multiculturalism then is fine, and it should be encouraged, as I said, and should be celebrated. But
what is it?
Hello and welcome to the Leading Communities podcast, brought to you by Aspire for You CIC and produced by That's All Media CIC. We're on a mission to understand what it takes to help communities to start caring, keep caring, or care more about an issue.
Welcome to another episode of the Leading Communities podcast, a platform where we help to develop discussions on topics vital to local communities, offering insights from both the leadership perspective as well as the community's viewpoint. Join us as we explore the issues, stories and experiences that shape our communities and inspire change. In this episode, we'll be unpacking the complexities of multiculturalism and exploring how faith shapes community engagement and tackling the tough topics of diversity and inclusion. For that reason, I have three esteemed guests with me this afternoon. Firstly, we have Abdul Hakim. He is a passionate advocate for the deaf community with a rich background in special educational needs and disabilities, also known as SEND. He currently makes significant contributions through his work at Islam for Deaf charity, and Abdul is dedicated to community support and ensuring resources are available to the deaf community. We also have Dr. Imran Suddahazai. He's the Director of Studies at the University of Bolton for doctoral programs within the broad area of Islamic education and finance. He also holds a number of other posts as part of his distinguished career, and he is involved in professional and personal engagement and dedicated to addressing issues of oppression and challenging oppressive practices, and we'll be exploring more of that this afternoon. And then finally, but we also have Dr. Trevor Adams, or I should say Reverend Dr. Trevor Adams. He is an award-winning professional with over 2 decades of experience tackling inequality in Luton. He is director at the blackhero.com and currently leads the Access and Participation Programme at the Christ the Redeemer College in Harrow. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Now, this week has been somewhat eye-opening, I think, for many across the country. Maybe where there may have been thoughts that multiculturalism has become more accepted within the UK, and then the activities of the last week leading to questions about the acceptability of multicultural communities and what that truly means. If I can start here with you, Dr. Adams. What's been your perspective of what you've seen this week in terms of the work that you do and the communities that you serve?
Yeah, I think it isn't just simply locally or nationally, it's also been impact internationally, because there have been commentators right across the globe commenting on what they see happening in Britain. On a local level, I think Luton is quite well known for dealing with these differences. We're known as a super diverse community. I think when we see what we've seen on the news take place, I think it re-traumatizes a lot of people, because this actually isn't new. Based on my own experience of the 60s and 70s, what we're seeing is a repeat of the blaming. People have been re-traumatized by what they have seen happening, because it triggers off memories from what has actually happened in the past. So we see that on the one side, where people are very, very concerned about the life and safety. But on the other hand, what we are seeing, perhaps more so than ever before, is communities coming together. Within the protests, we have observed banners, we see people proclaiming that this isn't the type of community we want. We don't want a community where hatred and violence defines who we are. And so, on the one hand, there's people, the experiences of trauma been re-traumatized, and much work needs to be done with regards to that. But on the other hand, we are seeing folks coming out as never before, declaring that this is not what we want for our community. We want to see love in the community as opposed to hate and hatred.
Thank you. Dr. Suddahazai, what's your thoughts on it?
Well, I definitely concur with the comments that have been made. So just, I suppose, build upon them and then present a slightly alternative narrative as well, which is, of course, what we've seen in the last few days. I don't think has come out of nowhere, which is often, it's a small narrative that we're coming across, that this is something which has come out of nowhere. It's taken the country by surprise. The communities have been shocked. I do believe, I think, as Good Reverend just said, that this is something which has obviously happened in the past. We have a whole history of this. You'll see from the 1900s, there were riots across the UK, race riots, Liverpool, Newcastle, famous ones, Cardiff, where a lot of sort of the black migrants, a lot of the Arab migrants, especially people working in the shipping business, because these were big ports, especially on the way to North America, they had their sort of places where they lived, and they suffered a lot at that time. So there is a history of this antagonism within the country. But I think we also need to look at the other side as well as to why it exists. Of course, we understand that any sort of hate that takes place, any time any community is marginalised or victimised, it's an affront to humanity. So why would a nation which is leading nation, first world nation of the world, how can you see such behaviour taking place there? Well, I think this is something which has been building for quite a while. We've been seeing this narrative building in the media, social movements, like you said, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. There's a dialogue which has been suppressed as well under this policy of multiculturalism, whereby I feel personally, having worked with indigenous white communities here in England, that a lot of them are marginalised actually. And so they need an avenue or they need a space where they can express themselves. And so-called far-right movements, and they're orchestrated. I mean, they're not organic movements which sort of stem from the community. These are orchestrated movements. They provide the right framework for these disillusioned youth to express themselves. And I think it's the first time we're starting to see a coordinated movement where these groups or movements have identified disillusioned youth, especially marginalised communities in the UK, the indigenous population, and is providing them some sort of platform. Now, is that right? Of course it's not. The way they've done it, of course it's not right. But it's only something which may exasperate in the future as we continue to kind of ignore the plight of, and I think it's an ignored community, by the way, and I'm talking about your indigenous sort of white communities living northwest of England or northeast of England, small towns, etc. So a lot of the economic policies haven't favoured them. So it's a problem that we should all be concerned with as a community, and especially somebody of faith. We're all people of faith. I don't believe our concern extends is just confined to our own sort of communities. Actually, our duty is a lot bigger, and that's to now speak to the wider community. So just initially, I'd like to make that point that I think the issue has a wider dimension than we're giving it credit for.
Indeed, thank you. Abdul, I mean, from your point of view, there's been a rising in not just a focus on people of colour, but it has also brought back up, I'd say, some discrimination around the Islam and Muslim community. What's been the thoughts or the feelings of people that you've been around over the past week and what they've seen?
Well, like the brother mentioned, it's clear to see that this is something that has built up. It's been built up over the past decade then. When you're seeing the increase of immigrants coming over, how they're targeted, how when something happens, it's more blamed on the immigrants that have come over. With the lack of work opportunities for indigenous people over here, the white community, you can see and you can understand to a certain extent how their anger has built up over time. And some may even see it as a culture war, because if you look deeper into it, the people who are rioting now, the white people, and I don't want to say it as if I'm just targeting them, but it is what it is, and we can see clearly what's happening. It's not a mix of different nationalities. For the most part, it's just, from what we see, white and a few Asians also that are rioting. And it makes you think, are you targeting, or is it a culture war? Are the people angry at a particular faith or a particular culture? Because apparently, unfortunately as well, with the case what happened with the girls that got killed, it's very unfortunate, and the person who committed the crime needs to be punished accordingly, which every faith, and we all agree that should happen. But initially, people thought he was Muslim. Why did they think that? Why didn't they do a bit of investigating to find out what faith, if he is from any faith, what faith is he from, and did that have a part to play in his mentality or ideology or his thinking of why he did it? Automatically, people just assumed that he was Muslim. Why is that? Is that because certain people are seen, when the immigrants were foreign or Somali or whatever the case may be, they're seen automatically of a different faith to them. Therefore, and why is it only the white people that got angry? Are they fighting a culture? Are they fighting? Are they against a particular faith? And they sort of like come to a conclusion, the wrong conclusion obviously, but they still come to a conclusion that we need to attack that faith because faith is the problem. So there's something more. It's more deeper. It's something that we need to more look into. But like I said, it's something that it's a shame that it's happening. It's something that we need to also look into who's pushing it. Is there another agenda, like the brother mentioned? There's certain people who are who's encouraging the violence, whether through social media. We've seen Elon Musk with his texts going on as well. How much influence does he have? Why is he even, why is he pushing it? To what effect is it having happening? So like I said, it's something that needs to be more looked into. There's more to it than that. Even the immigrants that are coming over, I've heard that a lot of them have been released from prisons that are coming over, and from mental institutions that they've released them and sent them over. Their crime rate is going down while ours is going up. There's a lot more to it, but as I said, it's something that we do need to look into, and we need to really think before acting, as well. So.
Thank you. I think part of what you've said and what I've heard from all of you raises questions around what multiculturalism actually really means, and maybe how that's evolved over the years in society. If I can come to you, what do you think multiculturalism means in today's society?
Oh, good question. I'd like to look at this sort of issue, if you don't mind, from two perspectives, which is obviously there's a general understanding of multiculturalism, which is sort of mainstream view. And then I personally have a view on it, which is obviously shaped by my own, let's say, faith identity, my own worldview, which formulates what it effectively means and implies. First is the general idea that we can live harmoniously together and kind of live in pockets of space where we have our cultures, our language, our likes, dislikes, and we kind of keep them within that space, and everybody kind of respects and gets along with them in some sort of melting pot, as they would. Now, there's no onus on us to really accept the other than to tolerate the other, and that's really an underlying basis of this, even theoretically, that you don't really have to accept the other person, but you have to tolerate them, which means tolerance is one of the big British values that especially the last Conservative government was championing, especially speaking to Muslims for some reason. But this notion of tolerance means that, okay, I accept you. You may have your sort of, let's just say for lack of a better term, Afro-Caribbean culture. Okay, I accept, and I have my Asian culture, and you kind of accept, we get on with each other. And maybe you'll take a bit of mine, and I'll take a bit of yours, but we kind of stay within our space and we don't try and cross those barriers. So that's really what multicultural implies, and I think there's a lot of issues with that, especially if you're trying to build a society, if you're trying to build communities. Communities are built upon shared ideas, shared ideals, shared concerns and vision for the future. And so that involves, and actually communities involve people of different faiths, ethnicities, different viewpoints within the same communities, and you have to be able to accommodate them. And tolerance is really a lowest rung option of doing that, whereby you just accept them for what they are, and that, because legally you have to, for example, otherwise there are repercussions. For instance, the people we're seeing being jailed now, they're being jailed because they've gone against social norms, acceptance, they've violated, they've attacked the police, blah, blah, blah. Are they being attacked because that crime was really motivated by racial hatred and there was a great deal of prejudice and discrimination involved in that? Are we judging those things? No, we're not. Which means ultimately that our system of judgment and accountability, as Brother Hakim said to me before the show, discussing accountability, actually it's very superficial. If I bring back to my own sort of personal understanding of multiculturalism, it's based much more on the idea, and I think all faith communities will agree, that you're accountable not just to yourself or the law, the nation or the, law, or the land, but actually to a higher power. There's a divine providence involved, which means accountability becomes part of your character, which means it should become part of the educational system which is feeding you, which now means that communities aren't just living or tolerating each other, they're actually trying to learn from each other. They're actually trying to build a better society, so that if I have values that you can take and I can take values from you, we actually combine them to build a better society, rather than just staying within our small little pockets. I think that involves dialogue, that involves building joint narratives, that involves really understanding what we're about. And I think, without criticizing the interfaith movement in any way, shape or form, I think that's where movements such as that do us disservice, where again we're just learning about each other rather than really trying to learn from each other. Right. There's a difference, I think, in that. And I think, just on this point, just to close this off, is for a true multicultural society to exist, and it's not to harken back to some sort of Islamic superiority, by the way, because we're often attacked, and this is sort of a platform for us to respond a little bit. The reason why that ideal is often quoted by Muslims and they look to this Islamic ideal is because civilizations in the past and theoretically all preach the same ideal, in terms of we have lived examples where cultures of multi-ethnicities, linguistically different people, culturally, faith-wise different people were not only able to come together but built some of the greatest civilizations on earth. And I'll give you an example of Baghdad, which was, Islam is often, or Muslims are often given the credit, at least to an extent, that they rediscovered all the Greek and all the ancient knowledge and sciences. Well, they only did that because the Nestorian Christians found a homeland for themselves within the Muslim Empire, because they provided them some sort of sanctuary. So the point I'm really trying to make here is that the ideal created an environment which allowed humanity to flourish in terms of expressing itself. That is tolerance, that is acceptance. What we're seeing now is this domination of this overtly liberal ideology, which basically sees you as a tool for the capitalist system. You're a cog, a piece in the machinery, and if you effectively don't fit that thing, then you are an outsider. And I think more and more people are not fitting that ideal. The dream isn't really fulfilling what it promised. So now we've kind of shifted outside, and you start to see those margins. So my idea of multiculturalism, just to sum this narrative up, is the fact that actually we start to learn from each other. We start to actually learn, not just about each other, but actually learn from each other. And that requires us to be humble, that requires us to re-examine the education system, and actually have community involvement, because you'll find more and more community is being taken out of the education system, whereby you had local education authorities with local actors involved. They have now been marginalized, and actually more and more corporations are involved in the planning of the education system.
The question I would ask, well, what was there before multiculturalism? And again, perhaps I might be slightly older than these young men next to me, but we had in the 60s, 50s and 60s, that government policy where the government said that the reason why there was all this racial tension was because those coming from overseas haven't been assimilated into the system. So those of us who were at school, the education policy was about assimilation, that somehow we would learn the British culture and become assimilated, and we would pass it on to our children and to our children's children. And all of a sudden, the problem would be solved. So they decided to go down that route, and yet racism was still there. So they said, well, actually, the problem is that there needs to be integration. So policies around integrations were put forward. Again, this was probably a time following that where you had the riots in the 1980s. Again, the government places the problem on the community that is experiencing the racist incidences. And so they said, well, actually, what is needed is the need to be an anti-racist approach, all right? Because if we had an anti-racist approach, then all this tension would not be happening. And then we come to multiculturalism. So there's been this constant introduction of all the different isms, then rather than tackling what is the root of it and the racist mentality that is at the root of it. I can understand the fact where people are thinking other people coming from overseas and they're taking our job. When we came from overseas, we were not given jobs. And even when we went for interviews, we weren't given the jobs, all right? And that's been across several generations. The reality is that there are certain jobs that the indigenous population don't want to take. Whereas people coming from overseas have come from overseas. So when I came over from overseas as a child, I was not an illegal immigrant. I was not somebody who came over to take somebody else's job. My parents came over to work to help build Britain. I came over because my parents wanted to have their family together. I went through the education system and I experienced a totally different education than my white peers. All right, we were all put on the lower educational strand. So I'm just saying that because when it came for qualifications, we came out with lesser qualification than some of our peers. All right, and then we had to go night school. We had to do all of this catch up bits, and then when we applied for jobs, we didn't get it. Right, we became overqualified. We had the experience, and we didn't get it. There's also the talk about these people come overseas taking our homes, taking our houses, taking council houses, right? We're given council houses. Oftentimes, people from overseas had to stay in one bedroom, one room, all right, one bed, and they had to take it in turns. So if you work in the night, you will sleep in the day. And then when you're coming home, the person, you would swap, all right? So there's all of that. But it's quite convenient for the politicians to be there and blame it on the immigration. It's people coming from, it's always been the people coming from overseas. The country where I'm from is Guyana. And we have 6+ different ethnicity, all right? Our food, our food is not typical African or Indian. Our food is very much mixed. So I will have roti and curry, and I will have Chinese food because it's all integrated. But when it comes to Britain, because Britain has never really taken a deep look at itself, and this is what all of this, for me, right, is showing that the deeper issue is very, very much, Britain, you need to take a look at yourself, need to look at your history. And in terms of colonial slavery, colonialization, etc., etc., Britain has never really been concerned about its working class. Never. Education was introduced so that the working class can work in a factory or work in the field. Never been. All right? And so when people from overseas come over to try and work and build the country, and for many people, the intention wasn't to stay in Britain. It was to be come to Britain, earn, and then go back. And can I just highlight what actually happened within places like the Caribbean and Guyana? Because there's what is called a push-pull factor. Push-pull factor. So Guyana, for example, was a British colony. All right? After the war, there were riots in Guyana. And so there were investigations as to why there were riots in Guyana. And the report highlighted that Guyana as a British colony, Britain failed to look after its colony. It let it go down into poverty. All right? So that's the push factor. The pull factor is when Britain went to Guyana and other parts of the Commonwealth and said, look, we need laborers. All right? People's conditions were already challenged economically because those colonies were let down. Then when Britain came, the response was, let's go and help build the motherland. Right? So we have it in our mind, the motherland, right? But mother does not want children. Children's come over. Mother does not want her children. And the children here don't realize that actually we are part of the same heritage, shaped by the same system. But we were the poor part of the family. And so when we decide to come here, we are rejected.
It's interesting because a lot of what I hear you say through that very well articulated explanation speaks to foundation. And combining both of your viewpoints, I mean, we're dealing with the Muslim faith and the Christian faith, both of which have huge multi-ethnic communities and actually have a huge amount of multiculturalism and diversity within them as faiths. Just speaking for a moment as a leader of the church, what do you see in terms of how faith binds communities and binds binds the children, shall we say, from maybe the ones that were slightly more favoured to the ones that were left in the back room and only brought out when necessary, shall we say?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I don't see myself as a church leader. I am a servant. I serve, and I think that's really, really important. I think part of where we need to go is very, very much a similar experience to what actually happened in South Africa, which is about truth and reconciliation. Know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Because for a lot of people who responded to what they heard through social media wasn't based on truth. It was just based on hearsay. And my colleague here, who's a lecturer, would tell you that it's important to be critical of what you hear so that you can get to the facts, you can get to the truth. And so there needs to be an openness. Let's have the dialogue, and let's begin to dig deeper to sort of see what is the truth. A biological truth is my skin color that has been somehow being constructed as a problem, okay, is because my melanin is above the surface. That's all. My melanin. Somebody's white, the melanin is below the surface, and so if they sit in the sun long enough, the melanin come up and start to go brown. So there's some deeper issues there that the education, historical education in this country is responsible for, creating the ignorance that lots of people accept rather than looking at the truth. And through the truth, how can we be reconciled with each other? You know, it's a bit, as I said, in terms of the example in South Africa and other places, they did not turn a blind eye that there's a problem. They actually said, yes, there is a problem there. It's a deep, deep problem. And if we do not work towards the truth and reconciliation, we are going to be thrown into a very, very deep civil war, bloodshed. And so for me, it is getting to the place where we begin to have that dialogue. And the dialogue becomes ongoing, where we begin to appreciate the fact that biologically there isn't that difference between us that we have been taught at school from very, very young age, to whereby we recognize that there is a common humanity. There's the common humanity. And COVID was an amazing game changer, okay, amazing game changer, because doesn't matter what the color of your skin was. Once you got COVID, and I appreciate the fact that global majority, people from global majority, experiencing disproportionately, but that was because we were in the front line. Yeah, we operate in the front line, okay, and so it is going back to having that dialogue. But I wouldn't say it's a multicultural, I would say intercultural. Okay. Intercultural dialogue. Through having that intercultural dialogue, I want to know what you bring, because that will enrich me. What I bring will enrich you. If we, as you rightly said, if we are held separately, we will never be able to come together and draw on the strength that there exists in our communities.
I'm going to bring it back to education in just a moment, but Abdul, I'm interested in your thoughts around that aspect of foundation and faith being a foundation and what happens when it's not.
There's a few things that we have to look into, and I always like to look at the foundation, and history matters. History is important. History will help you to understand what's going to happen, because history often repeats itself. And not only that, but there's been predictions about the future in our history. So history does matter a lot. And it is very important that we have different cultures and different tribes, because it helps us to get to know each other. You know, if we was all the same, then what's the point? Yeah? We have different ways of cooking, we have different ways of living, we have different ways of adapting to the environment that we're in. So it's important. And we should celebrate that, because it's something that will help us to get to know ourselves as well as each other. And we can mix with that. Yeah. We're all human, we can have mixed race or mixed partners, and benefit and learn and enjoy each other's cultures at the same time. So that's that. Everything has its place. In regards to what you said about our families coming over, my family, my granddad fought in a war, and my nan was a nurse, as many Afro-Caribbean they're familiar with that. Was a nurse. All my aunties are nurses. My nan was a nurse. So they came over here, not so much to build Britain, but obviously that's going to be part of it. But they came for a better life, and obviously just try and send money back home and try and better the family back there as well. So it's to better themselves. The Windrush generation, my family is part of that also. So so it was, like I said, to have a better life. Now, when they came over, they experienced certain racism and things like that, but that's something that, they had to just deal with, and everyone will be held accountable for what they do. We won't be questioned about them, and they won't be questioned about us. They have to deal with it. Now, us in our situation, now we have to just deal with it, we have to play with the cards we've been dealt with. I would say as well that the solution then, because we can acknowledge the problem, but the solution is seeking knowledge. we have to educate ourselves and educate our youth, as well as knowing that there's accountability. We spoke downstairs and we mentioned that one of the problems nowadays is that there's a lack of accountability. People can feel like they can do what they want and get away with it. People can feel like they can say what they want and get away with it. That's not the case, because behind closed doors, if someone says something to you, you're going to pull them up about it. So there's going to be accountability. There was more accountability when we were younger. I know you consider grey, but I'm not that old. But nevertheless, you know, we can see the difference. Even in the schools, we would get in trouble. Our parents used to get the slipper at school, never mind at home. They'll get it again when they get home.
My experience.
Yeah, we'll
so that helped. Mature us and govern us. I mean, we may have had our ups and downs and our problems with the law, but there's one thing that the majority of elders can say is that they had respect for their elders. Even if there was a bit dodgy, or whatever the case may be, there was respect for the elders. And that's something that was ingrained in us because we've been taught that, even if it was beaten into us. Some may agree with it, some may disagree with it, but that, you know, you can see the difference with a lot of the youth now. There's no sense of accountability. They can do whatever they want and say whatever they want. And this is a problem, and you can see that it's a problem. Even what you mentioned before about those white guys who got locked up because of the riots. Now, there's obviously, you know, there need to be punishment, but is that punishment fair? Because they have been made an example of. So they may have received a higher sentence just to be a deterrent for other people. Is that actually fair? That's not fair. As far as I can see, that's not fair. They're being oppressed, you can say even. But like I said, you know, that's something which I don't know how we should deal with that. I'm not trying to incite more violence, but I'm just trying to open people's eyes to say that, look, there may be another agenda here, and to seek knowledge as well, because when you educate yourself, you realize that, for example, us having differences should be celebrated rather than fought against. Why is there such thing as racism? When you really think about it, it's foolishness, really. And if you're a man of faith, then you can understand that the beginning of humanity, then the first racism was the devil not obeying God because he thought he was better than Adam because of what he's made from and what Adam's made from, even though it was an order. So that, in a sense, is a form of oppression and racism, even though it's obviously a different race, and it's built from, we believe, from fire. But nevertheless, it's a disobedience and it's oppression. So again, if you think about it, we're oppressing and we're being racist towards the decision, not from us, but from God. We're being racist towards his decision. And if you really think about that, that's going to make you question, hold on a minute. I'm just be careful of what I say here. I may be hating someone, or I am hating someone, or I'm oppressing someone for God's decision, not his. Because we're not given an option, whether we're black, white, Chinese, male, female, able, disabled. We're not given that option. We just have to be. We just have to play with the cards we're being dealt with. So therefore, how can you oppress someone, not for their speech or their actions, but for something that they never had a choice in? You know what I mean? You're in the wrong for that, and you only can attain this way of thinking when you start seeking knowledge. And you start understanding the reason for your existence, and if you want to go that far. But as people of faith, I'm sure we're all in this, we're all on the same page when it comes down to that. Now, coming back to your question about your question was
faith and foundation.
Faith and foundation. Faith helps govern a person's actions. Even if you're an atheist, that's your belief. So it governs your actions. And faith is important because the law of the land was built on it. The Ten Commandments, for example, as England, then this is a Christian country. Some would question that, but it's a Christian country, and it was built on faith, and the government was there to govern it. Now, when you take away that foundation, you lead people into you lead people into confusion, and people start to, feel that there's no repercussions, there's no one to answer to, there's no faith there. When there is like what there is now in regards to the riots and whatnot, there's no one to be accountable for. And sort of like to summarize it then, and to bring the question to a close, or to try and answer it more swiftly then, is that faith, like I mentioned, is the bedrock of England. And if you notice, Christianity is slipping away from England and it's going elsewhere, and they're highlighting that. Now, from what I've seen, it's going to places like Russia, because they're like saying Christians and we're, the true faith and this, that and the other. And what's happening is that they're highlighting how Christian they are and how unchristian we are in England. And people of faith who read the book know that there is a religious war going to happen. And the Christians and the Muslims are going to fight a common enemy. Now, all this is in the history books. As Muslims, we know that there's got to be an Antichrist coming. I'm not going to go too much into it, but before that happens, there's Muslims and the Christians are going to fight together. Russia's just put out an advert saying we and the Muslims are fighting a common enemy. All this is in history. And when you have some knowledge of that and you see it actually happening, it's mind-blowing that it's actually, we're seeing it we're seeing it happen in front of our eyes. And I'm sure you can relate in certain points of Revelation, you can see it happening in front of you. The mindset of children having children, for example. People not being in the right frame of mind and wishing death upon themselves when we know that to do that is wrong. So, like I said, history does matter. It helps you to see how far you are, who you are, and where you're going.
No, thank you for that. And I think it brings around a very important point, because when you talk about history and knowledge of self, it makes you think about education and the role that education plays in utilising faith or educating people about faith in a way that actually leads to more social cohesion as opposed to the distancing that we're seeing right now. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, firstly, I'd just like to say the brothers have touched upon some excellent points, which I'll bring into this question. I think we are talking essentially about this notion of education, but is the notion of education really understood? It's a word that's often bandied. Absolutely. And you'll see it just thrown about. Actually, if you look at the sort of etymological root or whatever, education means, from a Latin base or whatever, nurturing, effectively. It means to nurture and shape something. So as you would get a clay pot or something and you would shape it and gently bring it to some sort of shape that you're happy with, perfection, should we say. Well, that's no different to what the educational process actually is, theoretically. So what we're doing is we're taking children and we're effectively taking their minds and we're shaping them. Now, what that process is based upon, I think, is the most crucial thing. Before, as Brother Hakim said, it was based upon the notion of faith. And in this country as well, Christian schools, as the Reverend mentioned as well, churches ran schools in Britain till the late 19th century. Effectively around 1870s when the government got involved with its schools and stuff. And actually faith was explicitly cut away from it. I mean, they taught lessons related to sort of Christianity, but faith as a ideological parameter was divorced from the education system. So what was the result of that? You lost humanity, compassion. So no longer are you now concerned about the human dimension. Actually, you're concerned about profits. You're concerned about, the matters which are immaterial in terms of human values, but are based much more on sort of commercial or capitalistic measures, for the lack of a better term. So what we've done is we've actually creating societies with a greed motive. So you're no longer about sharing and caring, you're actually trying to grab what is for yourself or better somebody else. So you've introduced competition. We've almost become, it's probably not the place to go into it too much, but in a nutshell, over the last 300 years, we've been effectively under the sort of guise of enlightenment, we've been reduced as humanity, our place in the universe. Now, whether you believe in theory of evolution or not, that's a debatable point. In fact, theories now suggest that there isn't enough evidence to prove the theory of evolution. So you knocked man off his perch as the divine created being. That's what happened first. You knocked him off his perch, told him he was an animal, just developed accidentally. Well, there's no evidence, there's no fossils to prove all this stuff, apart from spurious evidence. So that was the first jolt in the sort of European educational system, which then impacts the world because they've colonized the world. The world has lost its identity effectively, and what we're doing now is adopting that European system, which itself is now divorcing itself from faith, etc., moving towards a much more industrialized, mechanized thinking. And you see books like George Orwell's 84, etc. This is what it's speaking about effectively. So education now becomes really training. Training for what? As Reverend said, for a factory. So you're training young, the new generations, the peasants, the farmers, and that's another point that I just quickly bring in, which is what I'm hearing continuously, especially from the populace, is we want our country back. You never had this country. I'm sorry to say it. The majority of the people in this country never had this country and still don't. Aristocracy owns 97% of this country. The Queen owns probably 80 odd percent. That belongs to Prince Charles owns half of Cornwall, for example, etc., etc. So actually the majority of people in this country never had any claim to the land anyway. They lived, unfortunately, in more peasantry conditions, farmers, if you will, even farm hands. They didn't own their farms, and it's only relatively late. We're talking about the Union of England, the Parliament, sort of freedom for these. So really it's a very late experience, and into this experience, as they receive their freedom, come the immigrants who are also now in this small little pie staking a claim. So you can see where the tension comes from there. But just to go back to that point about education, if I go back to the religious thing again, because we are talking about faith, if you look at faith-based education, and we're talking about Islamic education, because we're kind of representing, I suppose, that viewpoint, and Christian education, both faith-based systems actually have great models, excellent models. Reverend said, don't call me a leader. He said, call me a servant. Servant leadership is a huge concept. And it talks about looking at the leader as a servant of the people. He's serving them as Isa or Jesus would have done. And we revere him as a prophet, Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So again, we revere these people as servant leaders. So this is a great concept. Comes from faith-based education. But is that really what's being taught now in the universities and colleges? No, it's not. That's not what they're teaching. They're teaching actually everybody's a leader of some sort, and everybody can pretty much has the right to do what they want to do, as long as you kind of follow our policy and guidelines and do what we're telling you to do. So my point really is, going back to this, is education was based upon human principles. We have great number of schools, Montessori schools, Steiner schools. These are Christian ideological schools to an extent. They've been influenced by that ideology. They're based on humanity. They still exist today. And if you want that education, you have to pay a lot of money to go and get it. The ordinary child now, who this was meant for, who was created for, actually just going to your local state school where teachers are poorly trained. Most of them don't really want to be teachers, a stopgap thing. They can't find another job. Many of them are immigrant teachers who can't get any other job, and in local primary schools and stuff. So the quality of education, should we say, has been reduced significantly because it doesn't have the same value. It's not the educational process designed to develop human beings. It's a system which is now designed to uphold an economic system which is based on oppression. And a last reference point for this is, just because it's really a point of my own interest, is there's a Christian theology called Theology of Liberation. Theology of Liberation came from South America, from the Catholic Church, especially I think after its second sitting,
Brazil.
A priest named Gustav Gutierrez, I think he was born in Peru. He came out with this theory called Theology of Liberation. He said, if you're looking for God, then you will find God in the oppressive moments, the suffering. So for him, the native Indians and the Amazonians and the Africans who've been born over from slavery, what they'd suffered under European colonization, especially the church, was suffering that they had undergone. Actually, within the midst of that, that's where you find God. For him, that's where the church exists. It's not that building, and Jesus is there. He's in that. And if we look back to our own Islamic heritage, we also have very similar kind of ideas, whereby actually the real struggle for God and justice and humanity is in amongst the struggle of the poor.
Yeah.
And he uses Matthew and Luke, I think, and I've forgotten the quotes, so forgive me. But he talks about humanity, kingdom of God being given to the poor, all that sort of stuff. And within our own Islamic ideology, actually our whole history, and this infuriates, this is why people get angry. They get angry because when you just label the religion or the prophet and you just dehumanize things, you're actually insulting all of us, which is, the faith starts off in a very similar way. It's a struggle for humanity. It's oppression on a small community in the middle of Arabia, for example. A man is given a message, whatever, let's get away from that religious dialogue, but he stands up to that oppression. He influences all the disenfranchised. All his followers are young disenfranchised people. They follow him like disciples of Jesus. Same story. We see the same replication. And what they do is they fight back against society. Not physically, they don't cause riot, but they don't take part in all those things which are oppressive to humanity. They become examples against it. So if somebody's being oppressed, they're the people who will go and give them food or water or go and do whatever. So they're trying to, and what we are saying now from an educational perspective, development perspective, is that we need to replicate these models in our communities. We need to take on the role of those prophets. So I need to become if I'm a Christian, an Isa or Jesus or Muhammad or Matthew, Luke, whatever the great saints are. I do my bit in the community, and actually that's what we're trying to do now. We're working with communities to empower them. You don't rely on the government. They're not going to feed you. They're not going to clothe you. In fact, they shouldn't. This is not it's your duty as a community to look after yourselves, empower yourselves. Once you hand that away, then you're at their behest, which is what we are. And now we are no longer immigrants. We're actually second, third, fourth generation here. We're as British as anybody else. So that debate now has ended for us. And in fact, it's become irrelevant, I'll be honest with you. So when we hear it again and again, we know the media's steering trouble. So we've lost trust. In fact, there's no trust in the media or the mainstream narrative or government initiatives, because we've lived through that, as they've said. And now what we are heading towards is a process of self-empowerment. We're starting to form dialogues with each other. And what you saw as a response from the public was brilliant. Black, white, brown, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, whoever. They all came together and they showed that actually we're one people. And when crisis hits, more unites us than divides us. And
that's right.
Yeah, I think that's something we could do. So,
Quick question. What makes you British? Is it a visa or is it being accepted into the culture? What would you say?
Me personally? I don't think it's got anything to do with the visa. Plenty of us have got visas for all over the place. So I suppose it's more about a level of acceptance, the latter.
So if you're an immigrant, but you're westernized, and you go to the pub, you go to the football matches, you're part of the British culture, is that now, would you say now you're accepted as a Britain and Britain?
British.
And then my answer to that becomes no. And the reason why I say no is I can think of it. So to give an example, my best friend is actually South African born, but has grown up all of her life here, came to this country at a very, very young age, probably 2 or 3, so only knows Britain as her home, and is very much culturally, I would say, actually in a lot of ways, in my opinion, would appear to be more British in reference in a lot of ways to maybe even some people who were born here. I mean, I was born here, so to me she's more British in some respects than I am. However, abroad, so she currently lives in a different country, and she lives in Europe, and where she lives in Europe, she's very much seen as British, and more so seen as British there than she is when she's here. And that gives her a sense of pride because she's very proud about being British. But I say that to say that we can discuss our experiences and, as I say, recognise that she's more British abroad than she is British at home.
So how should the government or how should the people here look on her as being accepted?
But I feel like this is the issue, and I actually feel like you've touched on it, because you started to answer my final question to you all, actually, and it kind of, I think, serves to the question you're asking me, which is about what does it actually mean? Because I think to answer the question, and I will say this on a very personal level, there is, and I was born in this country. My parents were born here. In fact, it's my grandparents that weren't. But I am now second generation, shall we say. And in a lot of ways, I don't feel like what British should be. I am British, but what I see represented as British doesn't necessarily represent me. And so it brings me, or brought me to the point of thinking, as you were all speaking, that actually, what does acceptance truly look like? Because it isn't necessarily seemingly defined by specifically where you're from, or specifically whether you are considered to be accepted or not, or whether you see yourself as accepted. Because somebody else might tell me that they accept me, but that doesn't necessarily mean I feel that way. So there's a lot of nuance in that, and it does beg the question, particularly when we see that there is clearly so much misunderstanding, so much unrest, and so much issue around the UK about what people think British is, feel it is, and even British people who don't agree with the things that they've seen in the last week, speaking against their own communities and saying, hey, what is this? What is this about? So it brings up a lot of nuance, and it was making me think, well, what really is the solution? Is this about us feeling British, or is this about us accepting that multiculturalism isn't really about whether we feel British or not, but is more about whether we're choosing to serve each other's communities and work with each other? And that's what I was hearing from what all of you were saying. And it was making me think, I don't necessarily need to feel British, but maybe what I do need to feel is part of a community that has a collective purpose.
Feel accepted.
Yeah.
Feel accepted, because
a level of belonging.
Yeah. Acceptance is like a drug, because people will compromise themselves just to be accepted. Now, another way of looking at it is, to be accepted is that a skin tone, because there's certain people who, like yourself, lived here, been born here, and there's people that has come from abroad, from Europe, but they are more accepted because they look similar.
Yeah, I mean, my perspective on that personally would be that the thing that maybe makes people with our skin tones feel less accepted is narratives that come with it. So narratives like, you have to work 10 times harder or twice as hard to get to half the place, for example. It's narratives that are put around that then make you start in a place where you are quote unquote not good enough, or you are quote unquote not part of.
But why do you have to do that?
But that's my point. And actually, this is what I'm hearing, because from what all of you are saying, it is raising that question even for me on a personal level of, well, why does it have to be that? It doesn't necessarily have to be that. And maybe what it's more about is taking a step back from those racial divides, taking a step back from those perceived divides, even in terms of faith.
Why do you think it's that?
Why?
I know where I'm going to get to, but I'm trying to get you to that.
I don't know if you're going to get me there then, because I don't know where you're trying to get me.
Do you think your skin tone has something to do with that?
In some respects, it has. Yeah, I do. Okay. Feels that way.
Yeah, that's what I was more or less.
But can I just pick up a point here, that skin color is back in history was never an issue until the idea, the false notion of race came into it. So it wasn't, it didn't go all the way back to the Garden of Eden.
No, of course not. Because you had English people who were slaves as well as different.
Yeah, but the different type of slave. Race is something that's socially constructed. If you go back, as you said, there were people who were enslaved, but it was a different type of slavery.
It's more economical than...
And it wasn't based on skin color. It was very, very much based around economic, etc., etc. Whereas the transatlantic slavery was based on skin color, but it was also based on the idea that there is a hierarchy, of, so the lighter your skin is to European, then you're at the top, you are superior, dark your skin, you're at the bottom. And don't forget, like in America, for example, you're seen as 1/5 human. And as you rightly said, human beings became compared to the beast, compared to animal. I just want to pick up the point on education. I'm glad that you raised the point, because the word, as you rightly said, educare, educare, education, Latin educare, means to draw out and to nurture. Draw out and to nurture. So that basically means when I see every single person as a human being, in every single person as a human being, there is a greatness. That education is supposed to draw out. All right? We compare schooling with education, and we're trying to use the words synonymously. Yeah? And you are so right, because the top schools, Eton and all those schools, are charities. They're charities. They were set up to help the poor. Check it out. Check it out. They were set up to help the poor.
That's right.
All right? But the poor have not been the beneficiary of those charities. All right? So what we have then is a situation where the working class were manipulated and controlled and fed false information within the education system through books, through pictures, etc., 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 that somehow we are superior and everyone else is inferior, right? And it's necessary to go back to basic to get to the truth, right? That with every single human being, there is a greatness, there's the genius. Now, if that becomes the starting point in education, rather than what Paulo Freire said about banking, you're an empty head and I've got to fill your head with knowledge, as opposed to, hold on a minute, what can I learn from you? What can I draw out from you? What do you naturally incline against? What's your natural leaning towards? Is it art? Is it mathematics? Is it languages? Is it science? Because once I know that, I can bring that out. But you are here to contribute to the betterment of humanity. All right? If you go back into ancient Egypt, it was very, very much about not only knowing yourself, but also knowing that we are connected. So if I harm you, I'm harming myself.
That's right.
Yes? And so it is very, very much about how can we, in Africa they have the term Ubuntu. I am because we are. Yeah, I am because we are. And the land was never owned. We were stewards of the land for the next generation, right? But what we have is a system that says, this is mine. I'm going to hold it. And if you are struggling, if you are poor, well, then it's your fault. Not the fact that actually I need to reach out to you because you're another human being, right? Today I might be strong, but tomorrow I might not be. But if I'm able to reach out to you and to help you, we are moving towards the greater good. And that's what education was, for the greater good, right? So that all of us can benefit.
Jump in quickly, if you don't mind.
Of course not.
Because continuing, or jumping on from what you said about first what you said about the race situation, with identity as well, because identity is very important. It's not the be all and end all, but it helps you to know who you are and your family and this, that, and the other. But I think, or what I can see, is it backfiring, because many people who was taken and brought over here lost their identity and were just told you are black and we're white, and the history was sort of like erased, sort of thing.
Can I just add to that? Just make a point there. As somebody who came over, all right. When I first came to Britain, I was told I was coloured. Then I was told I was West Indian. Then Caribbean. Then Afro-Caribbean. Then African Caribbean. So we are constantly, we're the ones who are constantly having to redefine who we are. Your question about Britishness, it depends on the context. My passport says British. So as far as the law is concerned, I'm British. All right. But in terms of being accepted,
Okay.
So you go ahead.
I just going to bring very good point. I just wanted to build on that one. There was a guy called Paul Gilroy. You may have heard of him.
Yes.
Wrote
Professor Paul Gilroy.
He wrote "There's No Black in the Union Jack"
Yes.
and "The Black Atlantic." Excellent text.
Yeah.
And basically, he's touching upon what you've just touched upon, which is the notion of race, the notion of actually the creation of the modern day British culture, the song, the music, the food, the entertainment, everything else, and the influence that, especially if you want to call it, for lack of a better term, the Afro-Caribbean community, which itself he argues what an anomaly that is, and how African American and all these sort of terms don't make sense. But this has been systematically designed because they also realize that when this global formerly conquered people would arrive on these shores, well, they had to have a new identity and they had to have a new place.
Yeah.
You couldn't just bring them in and sit them alongside of you because that'd be a disaster. Because most of your populace isn't that educated. The people coming here actually are either very well to do or they're here to do something, i.e. make something of themselves. So the indigenous population would face this competition and may not survive that. So the first thing to do is ghettoize these people. And the other person who talks about this, and I'm an avid reader of his stuff, obviously, is Malcolm X and then the Nation of Islam movement, which I've looked at quite detail. Very interesting, because what they did was, and as Muslims, obviously, you always look at them and say, well, they've gone too much. And they had this sort of anti-white narrative as well going for a while. Well, if you read Elijah Muhammad and then Malcolm X, what he says, it's a very interesting thing. He says, our people had been reduced to the level of farm animals, but mentally. Like, they didn't even have an identity. Like, they weren't even people. So to raise them up, we couldn't just say you're good people, you're good, you're good little human beings and God made. That wouldn't really have the impact. We had to tell them you're gods. Like, you are divine creatures. Like, we had to raise their thinking because they were so low. We had to make it so high that obviously they wouldn't hit that, but at least they would hit something. And so in that sense, it was picking their own communities back up through a dialogue, which obviously you guys are all familiar with, whereby now they portray themselves as gods. But in amongst that dialogue, the most interesting thing is they don't portray themselves as victims. They take the blame for reducing themselves, and now it's up to them to, so you have to create your own businesses, your own schools, your colleges, divorce from the government. That's why it's called a nation, Nation of Islam. And so I'm not advocating now that we all break away and create our own nations. We're not trying to do that. But certainly there are examples that if the power brokers, or if what is you consider to be power, is not speaking to you on equal terms, then at some point you must respond. Because if you don't, then you will become enslaved once again, which we have. And we suffered for 2, 3, 5, 100 years, whatever it is. There's an important point here, which is a turn of history. So 2 dialogues have developed. For lack of a better term, again, in academics, they term them pre-Socratic and post-Socratic terms. And what they mean is that post-Socratic means you use reason, dialogue. You try to negotiate things because you're in a position of weakness. You don't have power. The pre-Socratic idea is just an idea. It means you don't justify things. It's because you already have power. So I'll do this because I'm strong. If you don't listen to me, I'll just beat you into submission. I'll put you in jail. You don't have... So actually, we've got a clash of these mentalities where the underclass, should we say, the ones who are ruled, have been brought up with the mentality of trying to negotiate and beg for their... And the ruling class is much more about ordering you what to do. And we haven't worked out how to talk back to power yet. And I think that's where we are at the moment. Yep.
Going from what you've said about our power, we have to understand, and I don't know if it would be dangerous to understand even, that we're still in slavery. It's called modern day slavery. Yeah. And majority of people don't even realize it. And it doesn't have a colour. People who have some form of power will be shut down. Tommy Robinson, he has power. Whether we realize it, acknowledge it or not, he can make a phone call and arrange and gather 10, 20,000 people. So he has some form of power. And you can see what they're doing to him. His own people are doing, and he's patriotic. He has black friends, white friends as well. He obviously has certain ideologies about Islam and and which has been, I have to say, has been encouraged. We spoke about his experiences in Luton, which we should say, as Muslims, we shouldn't have behaved a certain way, or certain Muslims did oppress him.
Yeah, of course.
Just to
Wrong is
tell it how
wrong.
it is.
Yeah.
They did oppress him, and I can understand. I don't agree, obviously,
No.
but I can understand what fueled him.
You're referring especially to when the soldiers came home and they were marching through Luton.
And plus, he was attacked as well.
That's wrong, but I think the soldier incident, which really caused was wrong. As Muslims, whether you agree with the war, and we're all against the Iraq war, Afghanistan, we're against wars, full stop, the participation of our troops in those wars. But when they came home, to boo them and to throw things at them and swear at them, I think it's wrong. It's not nothing to do with patriotism. It's just you're purposely now creating tensions in communities because those guys have served, some of them suffered, people have died out there. So you've got to have that level of respect and understanding. I think we as a community need to mature. It's not just a one-way dialogue, I don't think.
I think from what I've heard from all of you today, is that this whole system around race and multiculturalism actually is something that first has to be understood on a individual level in terms of where do I fit, what is my place, what is my identity to an extent, in order for those identities to come together and understand what it is that they're sharing with each other, how they serve each other, how as cultures and communities we can meld together. And I think it's quite interesting because I think one of my first questions, my second question to you was the question of what is multiculturalism? And throughout the course of this conversation, it feels as though a big part of the unrest that people are feeling, regardless of what side they are on, is actually maybe based on the fact that nobody really knows what that really is. Nobody understands the foundation of what it is. And understanding that many of our cultures and communities have been based on faith, whether it is the Muslim faith, the Christian faith, or others, that those faiths have been stripped out of the construct of society and how that has led to a level of confusion and probably misalignment within people and within those cultures. What it says to me is that shaping the future of multiculturalism actually becomes complex yet simple. And I say complex in the sense that there is lots of strands that I hear you talk about, but then simple in terms of redefining that foundation that people are building from.
But is redefining, or like I said, multiculturalism, could that be dangerous?
The thing is, it could, but
because
then I
culture,
think
sorry, it's culture.
No.
But culture is a part of a community's
way of life.
and way of life.
Yes.
And if you kind of sort of like saying we want everyone to be the same, then so to speak, then you're taking away from people's cultures.
No, indeed, but
time.
not my suggestion. My suggestion is when I say redeveloping that foundation, it's redefining what that means to people as individuals. You asked me a question about what does Britishness mean, for example, to me. And what's clear through your question is that actually it can mean a lot of different things to a lot of us differently. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but what it does do on some level is it means that how we may define multiculturalism differs. So by creating foundation, in some respect, whether that foundation comes back to faith or whether it's about other things and it's about culture, but by creating foundation, what you're doing is you're just resetting the starting point. And when we're dealing with something as complex as what we've seen this week, when we've seen so many different people impacted and affected by the activities of the week, and when we think about where these riots started, yet where they're leading to, what you see is just that it's a big melting pot and there's a lot of complexity that sits within it. So I say that to say, in order to bring this episode to a close, that what's clear to me is that this is an ongoing discussion and this is an ongoing area, but actually by us defining what multiculturalism really means allows us to start to build or rebuild a society that allows for effective multiculturalism. And it seems that at the moment what we have, it seems to be less or more ineffective.
Can I say, I see it slightly different.
Okay.
in terms of we've been given a term. So we've all, and this reason why integration, assimilation, we've been constantly given those things. The question is why? Why have we been given those things? Because from multiculturalism, you are going to go on to something else.
Yeah.
I guess for me, it goes back to education and the words of Marcus Garvey and Bob Marley: emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but yourself can free your mind.
Mm-hmm. We're bringing this to a conclusion, yes? Okay. Multiculturalism then is fine, and it should be encouraged, as I said, and should be celebrated. But
what is it?
It's cultural way of life. Everyone has different culture.
Multiculturalism. We all have culture. All right.
The ism part, you mean?
No. We all have culture. All right. So the moment you take culture and you decide to circle a term around it,
That's right.
why not interculturalism?
Well, okay, stick a pin in that. Stick a pin in that. Well, what I was going to say is that it's good having different cultures, that's fine. The foundation of the cultures go back to faith. Yes, because first it's faith, and then you have different dialects, you have different way of life, this, that, and the other, and you build a culture according to, the characteristics of the people and their practices and so on and so forth, and that builds a culture. But the foundation, the beginning is faith. Now, you can have everybody on a same faith. For example, Islam, and within Islam you have different cultures of people, but they all have the same fundamental principles. They all have the same faith. Now that's fine. But if you have different faiths and different multiculturalism, that's going to become a problem, because they're not going to come together based on one faith, as Islam has Chinese, African, this and the other, different cultures, but we all can come together and recite Surah Al-Fatiha all the same. So it all comes back to faith, with Islamically that is. But if we have different Christianity, faith, Muslims, Hindus, this and the other, there's going to be problems. There's going to be problems.
Why?
Well,
because the foundation is different.
Yeah.
But I think this is the point, though, isn't it?
Yes.
And I think that's the thing. I think it's, in order to build upon anything, you have to work out what your foundation is. And I think based on everything that I'm hearing today, that becomes a big source of the question.
Sorry, can I just interject with it's a good point that was made, which is actually, if you look historically, people who live together in terms of different faiths, Muslims, Hindus, Christians, Jews, you'll find the best examples. I mean, Middle East, before obviously this century, a couple of centuries ago, you'll find Muslim, Christian, Jews, Jerusalem was occupied. It's still by the three faiths.
Absolutely.
Now we can argue whether who was protected, etc., but they lived quite well together in Africa. I mean, you look at places like Nigeria and stuff. Spain, obviously, from a European example. I'm just saying about different faith communities living in India. Muslims and Hindus live together, Sikhs. So actually, this model worked quite well. And I hate to say this, but the truth is what it is. Until we saw an imperialistic project, a colonialist project, 400 or 500 years ago, which literally divided, conquered, and segregated the world. And that is unique. And before that, it was the Romans who did it. So it's not by accident that, unfortunately, we're seeing these models replicated, and models that have come from Persia or Arabia or the other sides of the world. They haven't engaged in those behaviors. They have actually kept themselves as a ruling class and said to everybody else, get on with whatever. We're not going to control you. You do what you want. We'll do what we want. But this is the first systematic experience where you have systematically, changed people fundamentally to the point where you've separated, torn families and cultures apart. I mean, we can go into it. So I think, yes, it is a complex debate, but there are some historical facts that we need to start examining. And the point that you made was excellent, which is, why do I have to accept this term? Like, I didn't invent it. It doesn't come from my culture. It doesn't come from my faith base. Now let me give you my term, which might unify people, yourself, etc. So maybe we need to be involved in the dialogue, I think.
Indeed.
So
So,
Sorry.
I'm going to suggest that this conversation continues over you guys breaking some bread, okay? Because it's a fascinating, and it really is. Seriously, it's actually a very fascinating discussion, and there are so many different strands to consider. You've definitely given me lots of food for thought this afternoon. I really didn't expect it, so thank you.
Thank
you
you
for that.
Thank you very much.
And I'm hoping that the audience watching this also has had much food for thought. It feels like there's another conversation that can come off the back of this, because maybe what we're identifying through this discussion is that multiculturalism as terminology might actually be part of the issue, and what we may need to do is think about redefining those terms in order to rebuild a foundation, and actually to go back to some of the historical lessons and the faith-based lessons that give us some guidance as to how we can move forward more cohesively, and as a community that's really striving to grow and come together, as opposed to one that's becoming divided on the few things that differ between us rather than the many things that we have in common. So with that being said, I just want to say thank you so much to my guests this afternoon. Thank you to Abdul Hakim, Dr. Imran Suddahazai,
Perfectly said.
and Reverend Dr. Trevor Adams, for your time, for your knowledge, and for sharing so much. Please do come back to another Leading Communities podcast, where we truly discuss and hash out all of the issues that are impacting our communities. And hopefully, as I say, you've gained some food for thought for the next time, and we'll see you again next time out. Thanks.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to keep up to date with all things Leading Communities. You can follow Aspire for You at A4UCIC. To follow That's All Media, search at That's All Media. You can also join us on Facebook at Leading Communities Podcast.